Hello, and welcome to a surprise episode 79 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave in Napa Valley.
Well, here we are again, 2 in a week.
Jon, 2 days ago, we said, hey, we're going to be stepping back a little bit. We'll do major episodes, but probably not more than once every 2 weeks. So how is it that 2 days later, we're right back in it?
Yeah, it's funny how weeks turned into days, isn't it?
Minutes.
I feel like I've jinxed us because I think I was the one who specifically said, never underestimate LSAC's ability to break some news and force us back to the forefront of this. Well, that's precisely what has happened.
Yeah, it's a big news day, and at this point, we are maybe 2 hours out from them having made us a number of announcements relating to the future of the LSAT, including LSAT dates. And so we're going to talk about all of that, but this is another normal episode, albeit it's not even noon here on the West Coast where we're recording. So, Jon, what are you drinking?
Yeah, that's the most abnormal thing about this. It's not even the frequency; it's the PG nature of the cocktails. I have got a coffee that I added some espresso to, so the classic Americano, and that's it. That's as fun as it gets.
There's no alcohol in there,
No.
and I've gone back to an old standard, something I drink pretty much every day because I just love the taste and I love extra energy. This is a Monster Energy Zero Ultra in the super cool white can. I believe we should get a sponsorship deal from Monster because although I'm not out there like X gaming it every day, I certainly drink a lot of this stuff.
Yes, this does feel a bit like a half pipe, though, doesn't it? Up and down and up and down at high risk. It's funny, in the last episode, we were laughing about people being concerned for your fandom of Tom Brady. And now hearing you drink a Monster Energy Zero every day, I worry they might be concerned for your health.
They probably should be. I've been told on multiple occasions, don't drink that. That's terrible for you. But I'm like, it tastes so good.
Yeah. That's usually what we say about the regular drinks. So
That's
at least that part's standard. You picked a song today that I could not be happier about.
Yeah, I went way old school again on the rap side. The title of this episode is The Death of the LSAT-Flex. And so I've chosen a song by the Notorious B.I.G., the very first track off a long, long ago album, very famous.
His debut album.
The song is Ready to Die.
There you go. Yeah, it ties right into the death of the LSAT-Flex, as we will see. Arguably ties into how we're probably both feeling at the moment as well.
Yeah, this is a really not safe for work song, so don't all of a sudden like click it and turn up the speakers, on a Zoom call. But I love this old school rap kind of vibe that is put off and the stories that are in the song. So when I was thinking about the LSAT-Flex dying, I was like, I need a good song about death, and this immediately popped to mind. So I'm pleased.
Yeah, me as well. This is what, 94 probably? The old days of Bad Boy Records. So there you go.
I don't know the exact date, but it is definitely in that vicinity. 92, 94.
Somewhere in that range. Yeah, well, anyway, here's a comment that I referenced to you a minute ago on the YouTube video that says he wasn't fat, he was just full of lyrics. And I think that's a fantastic comment.
He was full of great lyrics.
Full of great lyrics. Thumbs up. But let's get right to it, man. Time's a wasting.
Yes, it is. In fact, we'll start with the LSAT world. We'll also end with the LSAT world because the whole episode is about what's going on right now. And we'll try to take this in the most logical order because there is a tremendous amount to unpack here. The first thing is that they have announced the next 9 LSAT dates. We already knew the LSAT dates through April of 2021. We now have LSAT dates all the way into 2022, and these are fixed. So you can now start planning. You can count on this going forward. They specifically told me that their plan here was to reduce the uncertainty, people not knowing what was happening or when the next LSATs would be announced. And so they said, let's go big. And that's why there are so many tests here. Jon, you want to read them off?
I suppose we should. Each of these is a Saturday date. However, note that this actually just marks the start of that test's week. So there will be Saturday tests on each of these days, but there will likely also be Sunday, and for any that get large enough, further days into the week, as we've seen so far. So here we go. Starting this summer with the June LSAT, it's going to begin on June 12th. There's another test in August of this year. August 14th is when that one will start. October 9th, 2021, and the last test of the year is going to be on November 13th. So those are the 4 tests beyond April that we still have in 2021. No July, as you can see, no December, no September. So we have a sort of a skipping month situation that's about to start. And then we get into 2022, and right away, January 15th is the first test of 2022. There's one on February 12th, another on March 12th. So the first 3 months of next year have a test. And then April 30th. So I suppose the first 4 months of next year have a test. May is a break. And then finally, the final test that we know at this point is June 11th of next summer, 2022.
All right, so that is the lineup all the way into the middle of 2022. The first thing is there are changes to the way the test format is being administered, so we will talk about that. But one thing that I will say is this: all of these administrations are online, at-home test administrations. So for every single one, you will be doing the same thing that we have been doing for the last year, which is typically sitting in your bedroom or the kitchen or wherever that may be, and logging in on a computer or laptop, what have you, doing the same visual check. ProctorU runs the show in terms of like overseeing the test while you're taking it, and then ripping up scratch paper and all that good stuff and moving on. However, despite that constancy, there are changes that occur midstream here. So let's start with the very first announced test date. All right, we know April is a normal flex test. They've said that a while back. We now have June coming up. June, in honor of the title of this podcast episode, is the very last of the flex test formats. So, as you may recall, the flex format is 3 scored sections, 35 minutes each, 1 scored section of each type: games, reasoning, and comp. No breaks. You start, you go through the whole thing, then you are done. You get about a minute between each section, which is optional, but there's no kind of like 10 or 15-minute break. That is there. So that will be the format for both April and then June. Then things will change.
That's right.
Right, but
yeah,
RIP we'll get to that in a
Flex.
moment. Let's first off talk a little bit about some of the registration deadlines, because that's coming up really quick here. And that way then we can dispense with June as something to worry about. Do you want to run down the registration that they have for June here?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple things we know about it: a start and an end date. The registration for the June 12th, 2021 test will begin this coming Monday. That's February 22nd. It's going to open up at 9 a.m. Eastern, which is a very standard thing. So if you're looking to take this June test, which, again, as we will reiterate, is the last flex test, you can start signing up for that this coming Monday at 9 a.m. The registration window for that is going to close on April 29th, just before midnight Eastern time on that day. And that's a particularly important date, and I would say a generous one for them to have offered, because that is the exact same day that anyone who takes the April test will get their score back. Scores will come out that morning of the 29th in April, and you'll have until that midnight, essentially, Eastern, to decide if June is the right test for you to sign up for.
That's exactly right. And I will note that usually the registration close date would have been about the 26th or the 27th, using the kind of calendars that they have. And in talking with them, they made the point of, we know this is an issue, and if we could, kind of allow them to overlap, where you get your score and then you still have the opportunity to register, we wanted to make that happen. So they moved that deadline back a few days to allow for this to occur. So you said generous, and I would say yes. I'm glad that they did that. It's a smart move. It avoids all sorts of problems, especially avoids a lot of people signing up and then withdrawing as soon as they get their score back from April. Mm-hmm. So reduces a little bit of the churn that they might see.
It's a tight turnaround, but at least you have the opportunity. At least you'll be signing up for June with full knowledge of where you stand at that point.
Yeah, I would also say that it means that if you don't have an LSAT writing on your account just yet, when April comes around, take it. Because if you don't get it done in time, your score gets delayed. You could be in a situation where you're like, well, everyone else's score came out, mine didn't, and I need to know whether or not to take June. So get that LSAT writing done when April rolls around so you don't have problems if you need to take June as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Usually it's just been a nuisance to have to wait for your score. There are real consequences if you miss that June registration, and turns out you needed to take it. So, yeah, great point.
All right, so then that closes June off. Once we get through April and June of this year, the LSAT-Flex as a format, a specific format, as a name, will die. It's been a short, brief, incendiary run for the Flex, and now it leaves us in its wake like a comet.
Yeah, except unlike a comet, probably never to return again. I think it's more of a shooting star, I think, the Flex. It is burned out in atmosphere.
That's better.
Yeah. So, yeah, pour one out for the Flex. I can't afford to because, honestly, every drop of this coffee is keeping me going.
I wouldn't give up any of this monster anyway.
I refuse to pour one out for the Flex. After June is where things get interesting. So the next test on the schedule that we now know is August, specifically August 14th. And with that test and all subsequent tests that we know of beyond it, they're going to change the format somewhat as to how this test is being delivered.
Sounds ominous.
Dun, dun, dun.
Is it terrible?
It that way on purpose.
Give us the preview. Is it a terrible change, or is it kind of like it's not that big of a deal?
Yeah. So in part 2 of this podcast next week, we will explain. No. It does sound a bit ominous, like some mid-season cliffhanger. It's really not that bad. What they're doing in August is they're going to take the same Flex that you're used to, the 3 scored sections of the 3 types, and they're going to add an additional section. Experimental, 1 additional section. And here's the way that works, especially for those of you who maybe haven't encountered an experimental before. What it is going to be a duplicate or a repeat of one of the other 3 sections. So you'll have 2 sections of games, 2 sections of reading comp, or 2 sections of logical reasoning. One of those repeating sections will not count. The problem, of course, for people is not only does that mean you're testing for a longer time, there's just more stuff to get through, you won't know what the experimental section is as you take the test. It can appear anywhere and it can be of any type. But that is going to now be a 4-section LSAT experience for anyone taking it in August or beyond.
Let's just talk about that for 1 second.
Yeah, let's.
Because this returns us back to kind of like the pre-COVID era where we had extra sections that we knew were unscored. And we know that they put these sections in to pretest items that will appear on future exams. And if you've been a podcast listener, you've heard us talk about this repeatedly, where at some point they had to return to using experimentals because they were running out of questions. So this is no surprise to us. I think we've kind of been predicting that they would use a format very similar to this off and on now for probably like 6 months. So
probably longer than that. I think by about July of last year, the 2nd or 3rd Flex, we were like, when are they going to add the 4th section?
Yeah.
I've been saying this summer, I think I might have been 1 test premature. I think I predicted it as June. But yeah, this was inevitable.
I did not think it would be August. I thought it would be the test after August.
Oh, well,
so
we should have cut our losses and met in the middle.
I'm just going to make a quick test-taking kind of like note to people. This is really interesting because it means, let's say your test starts off with logic games, and then you go to logical reasoning. Just because you've had logic games already, you can't necessarily say, whoo, finally I got through that section, because you may now run into section 3, and that could be logic games again. And then you close out with reading comprehension. And you exit the test, and you're now back in that kind of twilight zone that everybody used to be in, where they rush out of the test and they're saying, which one was real? Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to see this after the exam. And remember, LSAC allows you to disclose what the topics were that you had of games and reading comp passages and so forth. They just don't allow you to talk specifically about answer choices or, phrasing or things like that.
Strategies, really things like that, yeah.
Yeah, how to diagram rules, that's out of bounds. And so I think we're going to see the return to people coming back saying, all right, my first section was about this. My third section was logic games as well, and it was about that. Which one was real? And that also means that as a test taker, let's say you start off the test and it's logic games and you just blow it. It's just not your day to start off well with logic games. You should not just stop there. You should continue on. In fact, you should do what we always say is have no memory of what you've just done. Drop it entirely from your mentality, because what happens if section 1's experimental? You get to section 3 and that's the real logic games. you're on a clean section now. The first section has no impact. So keep this in mind. The experimental has both positives and negatives, but one of them is you now can't start off a test badly and then immediately think, well, I'm done for. You have to immediately turn your mind to the idea of, nope, that doesn't count. Let's not worry about it. Let's move forward as if it's a new test and kind of take it from there.
Yeah, one of the things you and I have always appreciated about the experimental is it allows for, with the right perspective, hope, essentially throughout. There's always a chance that something that didn't go great for you won't count against you. It won't be scored. Now, after the test, you will know at least 2 of the sections that were real, so you can make more informed decisions after section 4. But during the test, you always need to rely on that possibility that if something doesn't go great, it didn't matter.
Yeah. And if it did go well, then don't all of a sudden say to yourself, I don't have to go do that again, because maybe that's the experimental and they're going to duplicate it.
That's not what I thought you were going to say. I thought you were going to say, if it did go well, don't think to yourself, well, it probably didn't count.
No,
Which
well,
I've heard
also
students,
that, of
I've
course.
heard students do that. Well, I'm sure it was experimental and went too well.
No, just keep it level. You don't get too excited. Don't get distressed about it. Just keep trying to go through this in that kind of like mental approach of staying positive and hoping for the best, but not getting too engaged in emotion when you're taking the exam there. How about the scoring on this test, Jon? What's going to happen there?
Well, this is where some really good news exists, because nothing else is going to really change about these tests in terms of how they're scored, how the conversions work. It's still on a 120 to 180 converted scale. The content is all the same. The topics, the concepts are all the same. Nothing with the test itself is being altered. Sections are all weighted equally. Questions all count the same way. Even the bell curve that they produce on percentiles will look the same with these tests. There's just one extra section that doesn't count.
Yeah, and that is being done solely for the idea of in the future they have questions that they can draw on that have been vetted out by actual test takers so they know that they are accurate and representative and valid. So this is something we knew was going to happen. It shouldn't be a huge surprise to anybody. We'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about how law schools will look at these various test results and how that will impact applicants, if at all.
Yeah.
But the good news here, still online, still at home. This is what you're going to be seeing after August, probably for several years. They've released the dates through 2022 in June, but I actually think it's very likely this test persists into 2023 and perhaps even early 2024, if not longer. We'll have to see.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I don't see any reason they would suddenly remove at-home testing, at least as an option, even in something we'll probably touch on again, even if they are able to reintroduce in-person testing at local centers. I don't see why they wouldn't allow people to stay at home as an alternative.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that as well. Right. There is one very nice piece of news that is inside this 4-section test. Yeah. And one of the things that you and I have lamented in the past, Jon, is that for some people, 3 sections was too long to go without a bathroom break.
Too long to go without going, yeah.
And there was a number of stories that you and I read of people having control issues or literally just making the decision to say, I'm going to let go. In a very literal sense.
Sure.
And we always hated reading those. It wasn't anybody's idea of a good time. And so we knew that one of the problems was in a 4-section test or a 5-section test, they would have to have a break. And early on, I think security reasons drove them to say no break. But I think they've understood that the way this format works, it's really hard to cheat on. And so there is now going to be a break during the 4-section test, starting with August and later. That break will appear between sections 2 and 3. We believe the break's going to be 10 minutes. You may be able to shorten that. I haven't seen an exact official proclamation of the length, but 10 minutes would make a lot of sense. 5's probably too short. 15's a little generous. And so we have breaks during the LSAT back once again.
We do. Yeah. You said it's nobody's idea of a good time. It's probably somebody's.
I knew you were going to say that, Jon.
I have the internet.
I didn't want to hear you say it. It is not mine or your idea of a good time for sure.
It's a big world out there, buddy.
People are weird.
But yeah, for people who would prefer a chance at a bathroom, you will get in the middle of this new experimental section test, you will get a break between 2 and 3. My guess is it's going to be much like the 60-second or 60-second countdown that we have now. It's going to probably be optional, or at least you can shorten it or choose when to resume. But there is a security measure that goes along with this, which is important to recognize too. You can leave the room, you can leave the view of the camera, but if you do, then you're going to have to run through a quick procedural security recheck-in, basically, before you're allowed to resume testing at Section 3.
Yeah, and they say that that'll be faster than the initial onboarding that you go through at the beginning of the test. More or less, if you leave the view of the camera and presumably go to the bathroom or even go to the refrigerator,
Sure.
when you come back, they want to be like, are you the same person? Is everything fine? You didn't do anything suspicious? And so a real quick check. I think that satisfies their need for security and test integrity, and it also satisfies the need for people to have breaks, especially during a 4-section exam.
Yeah, I don't think you'll have to do a room scan or anything again, but they probably will. Maybe check your ID or something. Don't go changing clothes during the break.
Yeah, because the camera will still be on.
Right.
So if somebody was to come in and start
I didn't
fooling
even
around
think
with
about
your
I just thought you'd look different, not that there's something scandalous in the background.
Some proctor is going to be like, wow.
Yeah.
But this episode is turning like, I don't know, into a dark and twisted ways here.
This is what happens when we don't drink. I'm convinced.
One of these days we need to do an episode where we really drink hard and then see what it sounds like at the end.
Yeah.
That day is not today.
No, it might be tonight, but that's
Might be in
private.
about 20 or 30 minutes when we finish this.
Yeah.
So the one other change here is that we are having a name change with this exam.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had, for years we had the LSAT, and then we had the LSAT-Flex. Now that they're going back to this and they see this coming out for the next several years, they are dropping the Flex portion of the title. So April and June are LSAT-Flex tests. When we get to August, this just becomes the LSAT again. So no more Flex, no other kind of version of the name. It just becomes the standard LSAT. And I think that's part of their signaling that says this isn't going away immediately. This isn't just another pandemic fix. This isn't something that you're only going to have 9 months of. We're probably looking at a couple of years of this at a minimum. And, there is expected changes in the future, of course, but there's too many variables right now. So I think they're trying to lock in the messaging that says this is what we want to do. You can rely on this for the next several years. And equally importantly, law schools can rely on this as being the format for a while. Because uncertainty is never a great thing for anybody, the test taker, the law schools, you name it. So this is a helpful thing as well.
Yeah. The hyphenate to me always stood for a interim period before something more permanent came about. And that's what we've arrived at, or will at least in August.
It did, but less than a year ago, we were able to have cool podcast titles like LSAT, Flex, and Chill.
Yeah.
So now we're going to lose that. So now it's just back to the plain old LSAT, and I like the Flex. I like the test format. Again, I've said in previous episodes, I probably was a little hard on them because it was a Herculean task to put this together. And I'm really glad they did it because I've watched other testing organizations like the College Board, who does the SAT, fumble the ball so badly that they've had to, literally get rid of some of the usages of the exam and certain types of the exam. So the LSAT has done a really good job with this as far as presenting the test, which is something that law schools wanted.
Yeah, I've actually been pretty impressed as well. Even the GRE, which has been run pretty well, has had its issues. So on the whole, this has been, I'd say a pretty shining example. The trade-off to me really here is you trade a break for an experimental. You get a break, you sacrifice that extra 35 minutes or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think, one of the questions that is coming up here is the idea of which one's easier or preferable. Is it better to take one of these flex tests, or is it better to take one of these kind of like 4-section tests? And we might as well address that right now.
Sure.
Since you're kind of like, leaning into it. And I think it's going to depend on the person.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the advantages and the disadvantages. The 4-section test, hey, you've got an extra section to work through. That's another 35 minutes of testing time. That's more kind of like bandwidth being used mentally. You get that section early in section 1 or 2, and what it's doing is using up like high energy period for you. So that could be seen as a negative. We know the scored sections are the same. And so expending more time and energy is something that for a lot of people is bad. And I look at it kind of like a little bit differently. I do think there are some positives. One is you get a break. That's really good for a lot of people. 10 minutes, if that's what it ultimately turns out to be, is a really good thing to be able to stop and be like, all right, I can just relax. You also get a safety valve if something does go wrong. There is that possibility. That's a little bit more of a casino as to whether or not it will play out that way, but that is a factor that is in here. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, it definitely adds elements of uncertainty, which is, in my book, never great. The stamina thing doesn't concern me quite as much because you can train for that. Anyone can train for that. You can overtrain for a 4-section test by doing 5-section practice tests beforehand. You can really get your body and your mind ready to do this for the full extent of it. So I feel a little less concerned with that and more just the general swirling confusion that comes from, I don't know if what I'm doing right now matters. And I think that always weighs on people a little bit.
Yeah. You take the flex test, every question you do, you know it counts towards your score.
Exactly.
Or doesn't if you miss it. Here, that may not be the case. That was probably harsh, but that's the scoring reality of it.
Point well taken. That to me, someone asked me already on an online thing this morning whether I would have a preference. And my preference here is pretty clear. I would much prefer the shorter tests because I'm just lazy by nature, where I know everything counts, everything matters. When I'm done with games is completely off my mental radar. When I've done 2 sections, I know exactly what my 3rd section is going to be. I like that. It's more predictable. To me, it's just more of a constant. But for some people, having that break and having, like you say, call it a relief valve, call it an opportunity to screw up consequence-free, something I'm obviously also in favor of, that can really tip the scales in favor of this new version.
And I think, for us, we view it the same way. I was asked the same question online today, and I said, I personally would rather take the flex. I'd rather do the 3 sections for many of the reasons that you actually just stated right there. But it depends on that person. For some people, that break is going to be a godsend, and it is going to make a real big difference for them, and they won't be worried about the uncertainty. They'll just be like, I'm going to plow through this 100%, and the extra time isn't a big deal. Just assess your own needs here. You have got 2 LSATs left that you could sign up for that are in the flex format. You know that the April deadline is coming up here on February 24th. So as of the recording right now, you got about a week. And then you have the June test, which is going to open up relatively soon. Those are your 2 options if you want to take that 3-section test. And I think we're probably going to see a burst of enrollments because a lot of people have realized the flex has been a generally good format for the average test taker. People are going to want to pile in on those. And nobody wants to be the August guinea pig, the first timer. That's why we made such a big point of saying it's not that big of a deal. It's just an extra section. Everything else is basically the same. Extra section and a break, a bit of a different name. So even though some people might be like, I don't want to be in the first group of test takers, this isn't an entirely new thing. This is just a slight extension and expansion of what we already have.
Yeah, to your point, it's funny you use the word guinea pig. I've heard some people complaining already today about, we pay so much money for this test. Why do we have to be the test subjects, the guinea pigs for future testers? The first thing I'd say is historically, this experimental idea has always been there. There was about a 14-month period of flex where it was dropped, but you go back into the 80s, there were experimental sections. Certainly the modern era since 91, the past 30 years, all tests have had an experimental section.
And it's not just the LSAT.
No.
Go take other exams like the GMAT and the GRE.
Yeah.
There are always unscored sections because they have to test validity in a live fire environment. It's the only way to make sure that the questions you see on future LSATs, future GREs, future other exams actually are valid items and have integrity. So I realized that after a nice break of no experimentals, it feels like an insult and maybe even like a slap to the face, but it really isn't. This was, for better or worse, inevitable. It had to happen. They were running out of exams to use. We knew it was a problem. We'd been saying it for a while, and LSAC is never going to come forward and be like, yeah, we were running out of tests. But it was clear that was the case. And eventually, at some point, they were going to have to, just because they don't have a million tests in the chamber ready to fire out. Now, with those exams in August and later, Jon, when this new format starts, when are we going to get the registration for those exams?
This is a little bit less clear than it was for the June test, say. What they've told us is that mid-May they'll be opening up registration for the August and beyond tests. So I don't know quite what mid-May is in terms of a date, but that's a good enough estimation that I think we can all sit tight comfortably.
Yeah, and it's going to be all those tests.
Yeah, which
they all
surprised
open
me.
up.
Yeah, you can register for next June over a year in advance.
Which is great. So you can really plan in a long-range way, and that was part of their intention here. And if you go look at all those test pages and click all of them like I did this morning, you will see very quickly it's like, this will open in mid-May. And that's what we'll be looking at that particular point. Now, looking at this kind of situation, what do you think about the idea of, we know that it's remote, at home, it's online. What do you think is going to happen with in-person testing? Is it just done forever, or is there a possibility that we'll return to it at some point?
That's a good question. I'm going to let the small optimist in me shine through here for just a moment and say I think they're going to bring it back at some point. And part of the reason I say that as an optimist is because what it would mean is that it becomes safe to do so. To get a bunch of strangers in a room together for several hours taking this test in person, I do think they're going to try to reintroduce that. I do think that there's probably less urgency to do so now that they've committed to at-home testing at a minimum through next June. So when it happens, if it even does, that's harder to say.
Yeah, I spoke to them about this, and their view of it is, I would say, very cautionary, which is the reasonable thing. They've set it up so that as needed, you can take it at home, do whatever you need to, and be safe and be covered that way. So they now have that locked in for a while, through 2022 at the minimum, but we think for longer as well. The comment that was made to me was, we'll have to see. Yeah. If there is a particular point in the future where the pandemic allows people to go into test centers, whether that's an individual testing center or with several other people, we may very well offer that option. They're aware that in some cases people are in areas that they don't have great internet, or it's not a really great testing environment. And so they do want to be able to offer something that's more secure and stable for individuals to take this test, but they have to do it with safety and health concerns as the top priority. So it is definitely something that is possible. I do think it will return at some point because there's just going to be enough people who actually need it. The problem is, or at least the reality is, we don't know when that is actually going to happen, when it's going to come out, or if and when that may be the case.
Yeah,
let's hope it's sooner as opposed to later.
To their credit, I think over 2,000 people have already been given the opportunity to test in person. They've established safe places for them to go, whether it's a hotel room that's private or something on a campus maybe. So they're actively trying to accommodate people whose home situation or work situation doesn't allow for this. So that's one bit of good news, is if you do have extenuating circumstances, talk to them. They can help you. And the other is that even if you do test in person, it'll still be this same 4-section test. They're not going to give you something different or treat you any differently.
Those are both good points. And I'll just add to the first one. If you don't have a machine to take this test on, talk to LSAC. They have provided a number of people with tablets to be able to take the exam. If you don't have a place that has a secure internet connection or is just a reasonable environment, maybe where you live is too loud, they will give you vouchers to go to a hotel and take the test. So they have tried to say, hey, the reality is a lot of people can take it at home, but we also realize that some people cannot, and we're going to attempt to work with them. And I've heard very good reports about that process, by the way.
I have too.
So that has been something that's been actually pretty cool that they've been able to do. And that allows equal access for everybody, no matter your situation or circumstance, no matter what electronics you have or where you live, there's always an option. And of course, that's why when in-person testing is possible in the future, I think they'll get back to it. But you are right, Jon. It will be the exact same test. There won't be, hey, come out and take it in person. It's a 5-section test now. You'll have the same 4-section test that we're talking about with August with 3 scored sections and 1 unscored section.
Perfect. Well, I think that almost wraps it up. There were a couple of student questions that I know you and I have both gotten already. It's amazing how quick the wheel turns in this. That maybe we can close out by just addressing.
Yeah, I think they're important too.
Okay.
The first one is the schools have a preference as to which LSAT score you get, a regular LSAT or an LSAT-Flex score, and will they treat people who take each test format any differently?
Yeah. This was one of the first panicky streams of questions I started to get this morning. So I already have a Flex score. Oh no, I'm not applying till this fall against people who take the LSAT, as it's about to be called again. Will that matter to schools? How are they going to treat me? And the answer, happily, is that schools are not going to treat these tests any differently. All of them are equivalent, including pre-Flex, the 5-section test that people were doing before the Flex came about. All of these tests in the eyes of admissions committees are identical, interchangeable. The scores are the same.
And that is 100% the case. Mm-hmm. The scoring scale on this is still 120 to 180. And I'll be honest with you, law school admissions offices don't care if it says LSAT or LSAT-Flex on it. They don't have time to think, wait, did this person take May 2020? I remember that scale. They just don't go down that pathway. And here's why. They don't have to report which test format you took. They just have to report your score. And since all these scores are on this 120 to 180 scale, that's all they care about. I know it's easy to think, well, they're really going to get into this and think about it. They aren't. They really aren't, because it doesn't matter to them. As long as they're convinced you can do well at their school, they're going to use that high score, and that's what you become, whether it's a Flex or a regular LSAT or a 4-section test, whatever it may actually be. So I think we can put that to rest with 100% confidence.
Completely agree.
What's the next question?
Well, this is a question you and I have as well, which is, are any of these future tests going to be disclosed? Will they release the test content after the fact? To us, to students, to licensees? And the answer, at least as far as my insight goes, is I don't know, but I'm not very confident. In other words, I would say it's unlikely, given what I've seen them do.
Well, I'd agree with you, at least in part.
Barring one exception, of course.
Yeah. Why are they bringing back the experimental? Because they need to test items because they're getting low. I mean, they just did this Flex for a while and they didn't get any testing for over a year. That's a long time in the life cycle of a test like this. So that means that they want to keep as many tests as reusable as possible. You start handing them out and disclosing them, that completely defeats the purpose of what you were doing. So right now they haven't made an official announcement that says disclosed versus non-disclosed. And of course, you can bet that's one of the questions we'll be asking in the next opportunity. I do think there is a chance that like May 2020, we might see a random disclosure. Like we may get one from 2021. We may get a single test in 2022 where we get 3 sections that are scored. I could see them doing that and saying, hey, we have a long record of disclosing tests. Most people wouldn't know this, but the LSAT was very early on in the process of disclosing tests to the public. They were much more generous, I guess is the right word, in giving out those tests compared to tests like the MCAT, for example, which never wanted to release any of the exams. So the history of LSAC here, and I would imagine some of the people at LSAC don't even know this, has actually always been to be extremely proactive and positive in returning tests to the public for the use in terms of studying. So I don't think they want to break that pattern. And I think we'll end up seeing a test a year, which I'll take it. It's better than nothing. Mm-hmm. I don't need to see every single test. I think we've proven that sometimes at this point there's so many exams out there, people are having a hard time getting through all of them. But it'd be nice to get kind of like a regular update from them.
Yeah, that was the one exception that I referenced a second ago when they surprised us with one of the forms from the May 2020, the first ever Flex. I don't think either of us necessarily saw that coming, but we were certainly grateful when it did.
No, we'd been agitating them, and I'd been, tweeting to the effect of, this will be the first year in like 30 plus years that they didn't release one. And then like a couple weeks later, they're like, we're going to release one. I was like, all right.
I think it was more like, fine, we'll release one. Leave us alone,
Stop
David.
Whining.
Yeah.
Stop whining. Let's close out on a question that we've gotten about how to prepare for this test.
Sure.
And Jon, I'm going to largely leave it to you, but I'm going to open by actually addressing a variant of this question that I was asked this morning. the question comes down to, are we changing our books and our courses to account for the new test? And the answer is yes. And it'll happen in 2 phases probably. Our books probably won't change immediately. In fact, I know they won't change immediately. But later on this spring, I will sit down, as will you, with me, and we will go through the books and make some changes to the presentation of the number of sections and so forth. The nice thing about the LSAT Bibles is that each one of them covers an individual topic here that is on all of these tests. Logic Games is going to be on all the test dates that they've released. Logical Reasoning will also be on each test. Same with Reading Comprehension. So currently, you see a lot of the books on the market, ours as well as others. You see a lot of website articles and so forth that talk about like a 4-section LSAT as if all 4 sections are scored. That's the big difference. The content is the same as you said before. Mm-hmm. The other side of that is, well, what about our course materials? Those actually will update more quickly. Those will update here in the next month or so now that we know this is the case, that this is permanent. We've kind of been waiting to see what they would do. So as we move forward here, both our books and courses will update. But the beautiful thing, at least for our purposes, is everything we teach in the classes, everything we teach in the books, everything we tutor, that content is still the same. There's still conditional reasoning. There's still grouping games. There's still going to be really tough passages with dense sciencey language in them. And that's the kind of stuff that we cover in all the ways that we present, kind of like teaching on this particular subject. So that's the good news there. All we have here is some section flipping around in terms of numbers and experimentals and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, the question came up a second ago about will schools treat these tests differently, and the answer was a resounding no, for the principal reason that what contributes to your outcome, your results here, hasn't changed at all. It's still the exact same concepts and question types. It's still the exact same volume that's going to go into making your 120 to 180 score. Particularly with the flex to the new LSAT. I know I'm not supposed to give a different name, but the LSAT to be. Trying to find a way to, right, the August.
Yeah,
plus anyway.
The new LSAT format called the LSAT.
There it is. Yeah, it's a little clunky at the moment.
The artist formerly known as Prince.
The artist formerly known as Flex, I think. Yeah, maybe we can just draw some intricate doodle and that'll serve. But in purple. What I will say is, in terms of preparation for this, and I think, Dave, you've alluded to this nicely, nothing really changes. The biggest change to me is going to be one of endurance or stamina. You're going to want to start to take 4-section tests just to prepare yourself physically for what that's like. But if you can do advanced linear games, you're golden. The same as you were for flex, the same as you were pre-flex. Those are still going to appear with the same frequency and of the exact same type. So we will change what we do to reflect the format or the new construction, but it's all business as usual in terms of what to actually do to beat the test itself.
Yeah, and the other thing is you still are in an environment where each question has an equal weight. Mm-hmm. There's not going to be 2 scored LR sections, so that is no longer, and not at any time in the near future, perhaps if ever, going to be the case again. It is roughly reasoning 1/3, comp 1/3, games 1/3. And so if any adjustment is being made out there, it would just be to make sure that you have those balanced properly. Because we know that, logic games is 1/3 of the test. It's actually a little bit less than that at 23 questions, but it has an outsized effect on people. You do poorly in logic games and it just colors the rest of your exam in a negative way. So if you have weaknesses, you're still going to need to focus on those. But a weakness in logical reasoning is no longer going to be an anchor that weighs down half of your score. And so, take that into account. You should have been doing that anyway with the flex format. Precisely. But if you haven't, or you're just coming to this and you're like, wait, I thought the LSAT was, 4 scored sections. Now that's just something to keep in mind as you go forward.
Yeah, the biggest sigh of relief I've had all day, frankly, was realizing that every adjustment we made to account for the flex about this time last year, really, is going to hold perfectly true for this new version as well. Nothing needs to change from flex to this in terms of how you prepare, aside from, as I said, just making sure you're ready for that extra bit of time for the experimental. So that to me was like the highlight of my day, probably, is we don't actually have to rewrite anything. We just have to account for the new format.
Oh, it made me happy too.
I'm sure it did.
Usually changes by LSAC cause all sorts of ripple effects throughout everything that we do. And again, this will cause ripple effects, but they're not devastating as some of them have been in the past.
Yeah, and ditto for students as well. This isn't just about our workload. I think students are going to find this to be more or less a very consistent transition, or easy transition.
Yeah, it's not quite business as usual, but it's not unusual either. It's pretty close to what we've been working with. And obviously, there'll be questions that come up about the changes that are here.
Sure.
If anybody does have questions, you can reach us on our LSAT forum. You can, post messages on Twitter that we'll respond to publicly as well. We'll definitely be floating around with this. And of course, let's not forget to mention, Jon, that one of the big main events is coming up starting this weekend. We've got the February LSAT. So we'll certainly be around for that as well. And as I said in the last episode, a mere 2 days ago, less than 48 hours ago, we will as well be doing a recap episode probably in about a week or so that covers the February test and makes scale predictions and recaps what was on there. So business as usual as far as that.
Perfect. Yeah, this eclipsed that for just a brief blip. But honestly, after recording this, it's going to be back to February and back to getting that Bibles course continued through production.
Yeah, this was hot off the presses news, so we wanted to talk about it and just kind of go through what we knew, and I hope we didn't forget anything. But that about wraps it up on my side. You got any final words?
I'm good to go, man. Nicely covered, nicely done. It's tricky to be the first to press sometimes with this stuff. You get hit with the avalanche of all the first questions, but I think we've covered it.
Yeah, and I've enjoyed it so far as well. So let's close it out. If you get a chance to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it, please do so. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment and give us a rating as well. And if you have any questions for a future episode, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, you got opportunities to register for LSATs right through this year and next year. So get to work on those, but stay safe out there. Thanks so much.